With a political earthquake of a twist, President Donald Trump not only withdrew his threat to use military force to seize control of Greenland, a self-governing territory of Denmark that he had pursued aggressively for weeks, but also denied almost the entire previous coercive strategy. Before this softening occurred, Trump had publicly threatened to impose tariffs of up to 25% on imports from 8 European countries, including Germany, France, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Belgium, unless these countries agreed to let the US buy Greenland outright, according to a statement on social media platform Truth Social on January 17, 2026. These tariffs were set to start at 10% on February 1, 2026, and rise to 25% in June, causing alarm among NATO allies as this was a potential trade war between long-standing partners. Furthermore, Trump even declared he was willing to consider military force as one of the options to take Greenland if necessary. The data shows that this threat raised serious concerns among European nations, as the transatlantic relationship faced an unprecedented risk of tension. Strong opposition from these countries, with large protests in Copenhagen, estimated at 20,000 people, and Nuuk, around 5,000 people, roughly 25% of Greenland's capital population, against the policy, with the slogan, "Greenland is not for sale," echoing through the streets. However, just a few days after this wave of strong reactions, at the 2026 World Economic Forum, WEF, in Davos, Trump completely changed his stance. He announced, "The US will not use force to take Greenland," even revealing that negotiations with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had formed the framework for a future agreement concerning Greenland and the entire Arctic. A sudden declaration that dramatically cooled the previously extreme positions. Not only did Trump deny using force, but he also officially withdrew his tariff threat, which had cast a shadow over the European economy, causing global stock indices to rise immediately afterward. For example, the Nikkei 225 increased by 1.72%, and the Topix rose by 0.97% in the trading session following this announcement. From the threat of a 25% tariff on Europe to images of a map of Greenland covered in the US flag with the word "soon," and finally to a statement of reconciliation and negotiation, this situation leaves the world asking, what prompted President Donald Trump's dramatic shift on Greenland? Execution pressure. Military option is expensive and impossible. Internal divisions push for a deal. When President Donald Trump began confronting Greenland, what initially seemed like a simple battle quickly turned into a high-stakes political game. Trump, known for his decisive nature, did not hesitate to threaten the use of military force and even impose tariffs on NATO allies to force them to make concessions over Greenland. A bold move, it could be likened to a sharp knife held high, ready to sever transatlantic relations. However, within a short period, Trump had to retract this decision, and this change was not random, but rather reflected a lengthy process shaped by multiple pressures from various factors. This shift stemmed from internal dissent within the White House, where many senior officials disagreed with the military option. According to 2 sources within the White House, Trump's aides began to express concerns over the long-term impact of using force. One official admitted, "Threatening military action against Greenland could destroy our relationship with NATO allies, and this was deemed unacceptable." With over 30 NATO member countries involved, every decision made by the US would not only affect national policy, but also disrupt the collective security framework. Countries like Germany, France, the UK, and the Nordic nations feared that a military action against Greenland would undermine trust in the NATO alliance, which in the current climate was more important than ever to counter threats from Russia and China. Not only NATO, but even within the US government, there was a sharp divide over how to approach Greenland. A group of officials favored peaceful measures to avoid military escalation, while another group, led by Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, continued to support the use of military force to annex Greenland. However, this division only increased the pressure on Trump, as those within his administration recognized that using force could push the US into a major diplomatic crisis. And when policies began to meet resistance from public opinion in the US, Trump realized that the military option was expensive and unfeasible. Public pressure could not be overlooked either. A survey published at the end of 2025 showed that only about 8% of Americans supported using military force to seize Greenland. This figure was a clear sign that Americans were not in favor of an invasion and were concerned about the consequences of a trade or military war with NATO allies. Over 70% of Americans expressed worry that a war with Western nations could lead to an economic crisis, directly harming the US economy. This created further pressure on Trump, forcing him to reconsider and abandon the military option. In addition, NATO's strong opposition and the stance of allied nations also played a role in pushing Trump to change his strategy. Senior officials in the White House were acutely aware that if the US continued to threaten military action, it would destroy its relationship with NATO. One official within the administration remarked, "If we continue down the military path, we will face an unprecedented diplomatic crisis." This pressure was impossible to ignore, especially as the US needed close cooperation with NATO to deal with challenges from powerhouses like Russia and China, as well as to safeguard crucial Arctic shipping routes. Alliance pressure. NATO. Stress-tested. Europe prepares retaliation. However, unlike simple trade conflicts, Europe's response this time was not limited to mere criticism. It involved a series of strong actions to prepare for a counterattack. NATO, the organization that protects the national security of the US and its allies, with over 30 member countries, vehemently opposed the military option and did not hesitate to display its strength. One of the concrete steps was Operation Arctic Endurance, a military exercise led by Denmark, with participation from NATO and other member states like Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, and the UK. The goal was to prevent any military actions aimed at Greenland while affirming NATO's absolute protection of Denmark and Greenland's sovereignty. This sent a powerful signal to Washington: there will be no military threats or coercion. The EU could not stand idly by. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen immediately directed the creation of a Northern Arctic Security Assistance Package, collaborating with NATO allies to protect the region, while stressing that Denmark and Greenland's sovereignty is non-negotiable. However, the response did not stop there. A major move was the European Parliament's postponement of a bilateral trade agreement with the US, an important agreement expected to boost transatlantic economic relations. This action could be seen as a strong reaction to the threats from the US, showing that the EU was not easily dragged into this coercive game. Meanwhile, other European leaders continually emphasized the importance of Greenland in the global security system. French President Emmanuel Macron was outspoken, calling Trump's tariff threats unacceptable, signaling that Europe was standing up against US threats. Leaders from Germany, Norway, and the UK reiterated that Greenland is part of Denmark, and it's not for sale. This unity demonstrated that NATO and Europe would not back down in the face of US pressure, but were prepared to respond with powerful measures. In those tense days, transatlantic relations were put to a stress test, with European leaders openly stating that they were ready to defend themselves and would not hesitate to retaliate. Even if this could shake the multi-trillion-dollar economy, they would not allow this coercion to continue. This marked a significant shift in diplomatic moves from both sides, and the pressure from Europe forced Trump to take a step back strategically, shifting from military and coercive tactics to a diplomatic deal approach. Finally, cost pressure, markets, USD trade negotiations. When President Donald Trump decided to pressure European allies on the Greenland issue, he did not hesitate to use a highly powerful leverage: tariffs. Presented as a card in hand, tariffs became a tool for Trump to apply pressure, demanding that European countries, particularly Germany, France, and the UK, agree to the US's demand for control of Greenland. The US will not hesitate to impose tariffs on our partners until we are allowed to buy Greenland, Trump bluntly stated on social media on January 17, 2026, immediately sparking a wave of outrage among European politicians and leaders. This image of Trump as a negotiator in international talks was reinforced by this action. The decision to impose tariffs was made to pressure allies into agreeing with the US's terms on acquiring control of Greenland. A direct attack on the economy of European countries, where each tariff decision could lead to unpredictable consequences. In fact, the imposition of tariffs was a bold move, a trade shock that could shake the global economy, especially when partners like Germany and France, with the third and fifth largest economies in the world, would be the ones most affected. These measures not only escalated trade tensions between the two sides, but also put the relationship between the US and the European Union at risk of breaking down. However, Europe was not easily intimidated. Immediately after Trump's tariff announcement, the EU reacted strongly and bluntly. "This is a blatant act of extortion," a senior EU official criticized in a press conference. European nations were not only outraged by the US's use of tariffs as leverage, but also began planning their retaliation. In a statement released shortly after, EU leaders said they were ready with a range of retaliatory tariffs, which were described as the bazooka in trade. This was a highly forceful move, not just a simple retaliatory action, but a clear warning that Europe would not be subdued by US tariff threats. A source from the EU stated, "If the US continues to threaten tariffs, we will not hesitate to take countermeasures, and we will not stop at imposing tariffs on simple consumer goods." The standoff between the US and the EU raised a big question. Did Trump truly calculate correctly in using tariffs as a tool to achieve his strategic goal over Greenland? Such an action would not only damage the relationship between the two sides, but also could severely harm the US economy. According to economic experts, if a tariff war broke out, both of the world's largest economies would suffer heavy losses. The US had already experienced the consequences of trade wars before, with the trade war with China being a prime example. According to estimates from the Federal Reserve, the US-China trade war caused a 0.3% reduction in the US GDP in 2020, a significant figure given that the US economy was still grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. After facing strong backlash from Europe, Trump had to reassess his strategy. One day after announcing tariffs, he unexpectedly reversed his decision and announced that the US would no longer impose tariffs on European allies. This statement was made just before the EU publicly unveiled their retaliation plan and can be seen as a tactical retreat to avoid an all-out trade war. Despite his bold initial statements, Trump ultimately had to back down when he realized that tariffs could not always bring the desired result. The US backs down on the Greenland deal, and what do the parties gain or lose? According to Trump's statements at the 2026 World Economic Forum, WEF, in Davos, the US will have total access to Greenland without needing to resort to harsh measures. However, the details of this access were unclear, leaving the parties uncertain whether this was a true purchase or simply an update to an international agreement on military control and strategic cooperation in the Arctic. Looking at the parties involved in this deal, the US, Denmark, Greenland, NATO, and the EU, we can clearly see that each side has its own interests, but also faces some drawbacks. For the US, the biggest benefit is enhancing its military presence and securing interests in the Arctic region, which is rich in natural resources and increasingly important shipping routes. The US will not need to bear the large costs of occupying Greenland, but only requires an agreement on access. However, the downside for the US is that it cannot own Greenland, which was what Trump had initially hoped for. The US still has to accept that Greenland's sovereignty cannot be changed, even if military access and strategic cooperation agreements can be reached. Denmark and Greenland may not have achieved Trump's demand to sell the land, but they managed to preserve their territorial sovereignty, which is vital for these nations. However, according to a source from the Danish government, the US will be able to access Greenland without taking responsibility for our sovereignty. This means that while Denmark and Greenland do not lose actual control, they will face an increased US military presence in the region that they cannot fully control. However, what Denmark and Greenland lose may be their independence in deciding to cooperate with other powers, especially as NATO and the US increase their influence in the Arctic. NATO, which has been involved in discussions with the US and Denmark, stands to gain from increasing military presence in the Arctic, a region that is strategic in the 21st century. This will strengthen NATO's position in defending member countries against threats, particularly from Russia and China. However, NATO also faces the reality that its member countries will have to accept US intervention in the region without having complete control. Finally, the EU, initially pressured by Trump's tariff threats, had to suffer losses in relations with the US. However, Trump's reversal on tariffs and the move toward a peaceful agreement is seen as a victory for Europe. They retain control over European territories and avoid a trade war. However, the EU's drawback is the increased US presence in the Arctic, which could create an imbalanced relationship in the future as the US expands its influence without bearing any cost to sovereignty. The framework agreement between the US, Denmark, Greenland, NATO, and the EU is not a clear-cut victory for any side. The US gains access but cannot own Greenland. Denmark and Greenland protect their sovereignty but must accept a stronger US presence in the region. NATO strengthens its military presence but faces the reality of US influence in strategic decisions. The EU, after the tariff threat, escapes the conflict but cannot avoid the growing US influence in the Arctic. Thus, from a bold player ready to go to war, President Donald Trump has entered the world of diplomatic concessions with remarkable drama. Like a chess player, initially making a bold move, he was not afraid to sever relationships, even tearing up long-standing commitments with NATO allies, only to realize that when his pieces could no longer move, he had to change tactics. The tariff threats and defiant military declarations now stand as fragments of a strategy no longer viable. In this political world, perhaps Trump has come to understand that when diplomatic competition becomes too big a game, sometimes you cannot win by pushing all opponents into a corner, but you have to know when to step back in order to advance, through persuasion, not threats. And in the Greenland battle, he had to choose a different path. Not a harsh hand, but a step back. Because sometimes softening your strategy is the way to maintain dominance in a rapidly changing world. If Trump has tried coercion with allies and still backed down, the question is, what will the US use Greenland for in exchange for what in the Arctic?